Welcome back to another episode of Crazy Dad's Garage. Selden here. We're going to do another repair video today, a how-to on my 04 Chevy Silverado. And what we're going to do this time is how to replace an upper control arm that's gone bad. So I'm going to turn the camera around here. We're going to go show you the procedure for first of all, so that you know that that's what your problem is, and then how to go about doing that one step at a time. It shouldn't be that difficult, but you know, a lot of people are going to want to know how. So we'll flip the camera around and be back to that. Okay, here we go. So let's talk about how you know if your upper control arm is bad. And actually what I have found here is that it's my upper ball joint that's bad, but we are going to replace the whole control arm because the inner bushings are not in that great shape, and the whole control arm's not too expensive and actually saves you some hassle. So you need to get your jack underneath the lower control arm there. That's going to be where you want to lift it at. I've also got something back there blocking my back wheel so it doesn't roll forward on me. And we're going to lift this until we get that front tire off of the ground. And there we go. Now we're up in the air. And what happens here, the way that I found this, is by grabbing the front tire like this and moving it back and forth. I'm getting some movement and some noise there. I think you can probably hear that. Now, when this is not something I can do by myself, but I got somebody out here to make that, to wiggle the tire for me. And what I'm doing is right there, I'm seeing some movement. So you shouldn't have any movement between here and here. Those two pieces should be tied together so they don't move. And what happens is when I push it back and forth, I'm getting movement between these two parts. And that tells me that upper ball joint's bad right there. So we're going to replace that right now. And I'm going to show you the process for doing that. Let's come back out here. All right, so our first part of this project obviously is going to be able to get the wheel off of there. I'm not going to show you how to do that in any detail. We're going to have to take this cover plate off here, which involves loosening these fake looking lug nuts. They're plastic, so be careful. I'll put the lug wrench on them and just turn them till they come loose, and then that will all come off, and then we'll pull the lug nuts off and have our wheel laying on the ground. When I get that done, I've got myself a jack stand so I can come stick it under the frame. Got myself blocked in place back there so we won't roll. And that's where we're going to go to. So I'm going to get the wheel off, and then we'll take that next step. Okay, when we do this, we don't want the wheel to be very far off the ground, really just enough to get everything off and be able to get that tire off of there. Alright, so I've got my jack stand under there. I'm not going to sit the frame down on the jack stand. I don't need the jack stand to support the truck. I just want it there for safety's sake. So it's up close to it, and that's where we're going to leave it. Now we want to, when you're doing this operation, what our goal is, we're taking the upper control arm loose here, and so you want to keep everything, the whole suspension, supported on the jack down below. That's going to keep everything in the proper relationships. The spring on these is actually a torsion bar right there, and that it operates on the lower control arm. And so when you take this loose, you're not going to be fighting any spring pressure or anything that you have to do there. But you do want the thing held up by the jack so that it's roughly at ride height, because one of the things that we've got to do when you replace your upper control arm, you are messing with, let's get in here a little closer, your alignment adjustments, which are what these bolts here with these slotted holes on them, that's what they do, is they actually move the mounting points of the upper control arm in and out. And what that does is it moves the ball joint in and out this way. It also moves it either forward or back this way. So I am going to show you how to get this thing taken off, and we're going to locate this so that hopefully you can do this and get it back in the exact same spot so that you don't have to take the thing in to get an alignment done. Now, should you get an alignment done on this? Yes, you should. But if you're like me, the reason you're doing this is to save money, and you're doing it at home, you need to ask yourself, are my tires wearing correctly? Is the vehicle tracking down the road properly, or is it pulling to one side? If the tires are wearing, or the vehicle is pulling to one side, or anything like that, then you do need to go in and have an alignment done, period, end of story. But I'm going to show you how we can get this point right here, this grease zerk in the top of that ball joint, is where the center point is of all of this. And if we can get that back in the exact same spot, then we shouldn't have to do an alignment, because everything will be back just the way it was and the way it's been working properly. So I'm going to show you how to do that, and that's going to be a couple of steps down the road here. But at this point then, our first part is that we've got to get this out of the way. So first thing that we've got to do here is get our brake rotor, our caliper out of the way so that we can get to the parts that we need to get to. So I'm going to get those off, but first off I'll take the caliper off, and then I've got to take this mounting bracket off, and that will then allow the rotor to come off. So we're going to move forward. Let's see, the caliper on these is held in place by two Allen headed bolts right here. So you got to have a large Allen wrench attachment for your socket wrench. Let's see, can you see my finger there? Where am I at? There we go. And we got to take that bolt off and the upper one up here. So we're going to do that first, and then we will be back here to show you the next step. Okay, here's your first potential pitfall on this project. These bolts here, by feeling on the back of them, I assumed that they were Allen headed bolts, and they're not. They're Torx headed bolts. So I'll show you here what problem I came up with. So an 8mm Allen headed wrench actually fits in there somewhat. I tried to use that to get it loose, and it wouldn't do it. It actually rounded off the Torx heads a certain amount. So then I was trying to figure out what actually fits in there, and I found out that it is a T55 Torx wrench that fits in there. Still, I was putting that in there and using my ratchet handle. It was just it was wanting to fold over in it. It wouldn't actually take it loose. So that's why I've dragged out my air wrench here to get to that. So what had happened is, see, this doesn't want to go in there enough right now. It's actually staying in place better now than it was. But get your Torx wrench in there and get yourself a hammer and smack it until it goes in there and bottoms out good. And these, I've actually changed the brakes on this probably 3 or 4 times in the life of the truck. Speaking of which, I don't know if I told you, it's a 355,000 mile truck here, and I'm just now having these problems with it. So anyway, I've done that. When I used my ratchet on there, the pressure just wanted to fold the thing over, and it kept coming out. So that's why I drug out the air wrench. You have electric impact, you might use that, but it took the other one right out. So we will see if we can do this on camera one-handed, which always is a trick. Where are we at here? There we go. All right. There we go. Because of that combination of keeping the pressure straight in and being able to do it without putting any sideways pressure on it, that thing just comes right out. So there we go. These are our caliper mounting bolts. Set those over here. And now the caliper will usually come off by pulling it straight out like this. Got to make sure those boots don't get hung up in it and tear them. That can happen, and then it's not a huge deal, but you got dust problems getting in there on your bolts at that point if you do that. So it's not wanting to come right off. I'm going to shut the camera off. What? Yeah, front wheel bearings. Friendly neighbor offering to help there. All right. So what's potentially happening here is the caliper is pushed out enough that it's and there might be a kind of a ridge. Yeah, a little bit of a ridge on my rotor there. So that stuff could be hanging up on that. It might be that it'll just come straight off when I get two hands on it. But I'm going to shut the camera off and go back and pull that caliper off now. All right, got her hanging off there. I was able to get a screwdriver in here and pry that back. And what you do, you just put a little pressure on it and hold it there, and it gives it time for the fluid to compress back up into the master cylinder. Had two pistons, so you needed to be able to reach in and do both of them. And when I did that, that gave me enough clearance here to let it slip off of this way. Yeah, it was hanging up here somewhere, not wanting to come off. So got that out of the way. That's not permanently where I'm going to leave it. Normally they tell you need to suspend those by something instead of the brake hose. I found that if you're just careful and not banging it around, you'll be all right there. So the next thing is you want to get your brake pads out of here. And actually, they really don't have to come clear out, because we're going to take out these two bolts next, this one and this one right here, and then that will let that mounting bracket come back off this way even and allow the pads to stay in it. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm going to go after those two bolts. Looking loose there. Let's go ahead and get them the rest of the way out. There we go. Those used an 18mm socket to get them out, and they came out. Well, there you go. It's that simple. How do you like that? They came out pretty easily with that socket. And then your next step is to pull the bracket off, which you may not have to pull it off. It might fall off. All right. So I'm going to put it back in there under the truck. Now, as you can see, I've turned the wheel to where it's turned to the right so that I could get to those bolts better. And I think that's still going to allow me to, okay, my next step is to get this rotor off, and it's got these two retaining clips here that I'm going to have to get off, that one and this one. So I'll be trying to do that, and then that rotor should just come right off there. It should slip out over this center hub, and that's what our game plan is going to be. So let's go that far. Now, actually, you know what? Doing this upper control arm, I'll talk about that in a different spot. Let's go after the rotor. All right, so at this point, I realized I don't need to have the rotor off in order to change the upper control arm. So we're not going to worry about that. We will get the brake caliper down here. And that's probably still going to be in the way again, because our next goal here is to get this nut off right there. That's the ball joint nut. So we're going to go after that. And I'll probably need to get the caliper moved back into a different position just to get to that. So we will see if we can get that nut off and come back at that point. Okay, that bolt is loose and just about off there. It required either an 18 millimeter or an 11/16 wrench, which are both essentially the same size. They will both work on this. So anyway, that comes off of there. Now that leaves us at the spot where we need to start figuring out what we're going to do on keeping this aligned. So I'm going to do two approaches here. I'm going to try to get those back in exactly the same position. So I'll clean them up a little bit. I'll make myself some marks as to where those pins were. I will also have the shadow of this thing to use to realign it there. And we'll be able to do that and hold that in place, hopefully to keep that in the right spot. So that's going to be my first plan of attack. The second is I'm going to triangulate this grease zerk here with some measurements, and that will allow me to get that perfectly adjusted and back in the right spot so that I can have it exactly as it is now, and that should preserve my alignment. So I will go about marking those. I'll probably get myself a punch and put a little punch mark right there in alignment with that, because I'm going to clean this up. And if I, put a pencil mark or something, it'll go away. So I'll put a punch mark there. I'll come over and do the same on this side. There's two pins on it, one there and one there. And I believe that this nut is welded to this eccentric there, but I think that the bolt spins in that one. So I want to, when I get those off, I want to clean them up with my wire wheel so that the adjustment is still in good shape or easy to do when I get it back there and I'm not fighting that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take a measurement from the center of this grease zerk straight over here to the frame rail. It's got to be something that won't move and go anywhere when you take all this off. And the frame wheel is a pretty certain thing there. So I will measure there from across there. And I will also get one from here to, I have a frame mounting bracket right here. And I will probably measure from this bolt head over. From there, clear over here to the center of the grease zerk. And I get those two measurements and I'll write them somewhere so that I don't lose them. And that will give me then my second set of reference points. Okay, so we've got our measurement from here back to the frame rail. I've got over here is 10 and 13/16. And then from the center of the grease zerk up into that bolt right there is 22 3/4. So now I've got myself some reference points. So the next step of the project now is to get the cone of the ball joint fitting out of this spindle part here. That they build those with a cone shaped deal, a tapered seat, so it sucks it down in there, and the friction of the taper grabs it to keep it from turning and moving around and stuff. It's a very secure setup that's been used for probably over 100 years now on cars. They are very difficult to get apart here if you don't know the trick. All right. Most commonly, there's a tool called a pickle fork, which is a big fork that you actually put in there and you drive it between these two pieces, and that actually breaks that friction connection there and lets it come apart. The problem is a pickle fork always damages this rubber grease boot here and has the potential of damaging other things. So I'm going to show you another method of doing this that has worked 100% of the time for me and every other mechanic that I know of. And the first thing I'm going to do is clean this dirt and gunk off of there. I'm going to get myself a pry bar, a big crowbar, and I'm going to set it in here. And I'm not going to use that crowbar to pry this off because that won't work. But I'm going to use it to put a little weight down here. And then I'm going to take a big hammer and I'm going to smack this several times. And at some point what it will do is it'll just slightly upset that cone-shaped seat in there and make it release. And it sounds crazy, but it works 100% of the time. So I'm going to get that cleaned up, get set up, try to get the camera here where you can see me actually do this, and then you'll know for future reference. Okay, so I like to, when I'm doing this, have a glove on, because if I accidentally slip with my hammer, I don't want to slam my knuckles on that bear. So I've got the crowbar going in here, and I'm going to put, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30 pounds of pressure down on that, because I'm not trying to pry this out with it. I'm just trying to have a little pressure so that when that breaks, there's a definite separation. And then I'm going to take my hammer, there you go, and I'm going to be hitting it right here. And I'm going to be hitting it pretty hard. And if this hammer doesn't work, I'll get a bigger one, but this should not have come out that easy. Okay, so normally you're going to smack that right there like that, and it's going to upset the friction fit that's here, and those will come apart. So there you go. It was easier than we thought. Might be harder on the next one. So I have had to hit these as hard of a swing as I can get in there. Sometimes I've even had to get in there with a bigger hammer like that and get that to do it, but every time I've ever tried this, it has worked. And what it does is it saves this rubber boot right here. So if you're working with a new one, it means you don't have to tear up the boot and then go figure out how to replace the boot or even the whole ball joint. All right, so there we are at that point. We'll be back in a second. Now, with our ball joint loose here, we obviously are going to have to take these, so this is the line to the anti-lock brake control down on the hub. We're going to have to take it loose right here at least. And then this bolt's going to come out because this is a bracket that holds the brake line to the upper control arm. So we will get those two things done, and yeah, then I'll be back and show you those off and out of the way. Okay, this just required a 10mm socket to get that out of there. Pretty simple. Get that loose and down here out of our way. Now this is a simple little plastic clip going over there, if you can barely see in the picture. So this comes down at an angle here and then goes back across there, creating a tooth that is hooked over the tooth on the bottom. So you just get a little screwdriver, get in there, put some sideways pressure on those, and those pop apart. And then you grab it, pull it back out of the way there, and yeah, that then allows us to pull that out of the socket, and now we've got those wires freed up from the control arm itself. All right, so our next project is to take this bolt out of there, and I got to get myself some big enough wrenches to do that. Get that loose, and we'll pull those, or get them loose and ready to come out, and then I'll show you where we're at. Okay, got those loose. That required a 21mm socket to get those off, and I had put some penetrating oil on the threads last night so that it would help me a little bit. That doesn't always do the trick 100%, but it it helps to lubricate those threads coming back off so the rust on there is not galling up your threads. I like to use PB Blaster. I've found that works best for me. You can use WD-40 or dozens of other things, I think. But that is one of the helps. Okay, so the next piece of this process now, I thought the nuts would be welded to these plates, but apparently that's not how it's set up. So let's get ourselves a hammer. We can tap on the end of these bolts now. And just a little tip here, don't use a hammer to tap on the end of a bolt that's cut off flat, because if you do, you're going to flatten the threads out and pinch them together, and then you won't ever be able to get the nut back on them. But these are ground with a taper on the end, and that allows you to be able to smack that end of that bolt there to try to get it to come out like that. There we go. So bolt came out, releasing our eccentric, which you can see I put a pencil mark on it there. This thing has a series of grooves cut into it around there to help with the adjustment as reference points. I'm going to take these now and put a dimple mark in them so that when I clean them up I still know where my mark was. Now I need to keep these, so I need to keep this one on this side and the other one on the other side, although it looks like it's coming off with that bolt, which is now ready to hit the shock absorber, so I got to think about that. I may be able to probably be able to tap that down and rotate it around to get it back in here, and I think then it'll probably clear the shock absorber. That's going to be my first attempt at doing this. If that doesn't work, I'll come down here and take the shock loose so I can pull it back out of the way, back this way. This one, judging by what's happening with the other one, I'm going to end up having to take this bracket off right here to allow that brake line to move back and forth so that I can get this one out, because I can tell the head of the bolt's going to come out and hit it right now. Yeah, and I think I'm definitely going to have to take the bracket off. I can't just pull this clip off and get the line itself loose. So I'll get that bracket pulled off. Let's tap that bolt back out so we can see what's happening here. There we go. Yep, you can see we're going to hit right there. And I don't think there's anything I can do to move that, so we will definitely take that bracket loose in order to do that. All right, we'll come back here when we've got those bolts out. All right, that was a 13mm bolt. We just pulled that out with a socket and a long extension, and that allows that to move out of the way. And then this bolt was loose enough I was able to just pull it out, and so we're in good shape there. Put that on the ground. This one took another tap or two with a punch to get it far enough out, and it did clear the shock absorber, so I don't have to get that out of the way. And now we have that control arm is pretty well ready to come out of there. Looks like I'm going to have to give it a little convincing on this side, but it's ready to come out here. This is probably going to try to pull down a little bit on me. I'll have to watch that because I don't want it to break any of these lines or anything. So I'm going to get that loose, get that control arm out of there, and show you what we've got. All right, just by grabbing that thing, actually with two hands and wiggling it back and forth, it came right out of there. So we'll get her out on the ground here. Now my next step is going to be compare that with my new one to make sure all my holes are in the same places. And then I'm going to get my wire brush in here and clean this area up really good on all four sides of both of these so that I have something nice, good, and solid. I like, when I put stuff back together, I like to go back together clean. It just makes a lot of difference. I'm going to take these bolts and eccentrics and probably even my other nuts and bolts, and I'm just going to wire wheel them to clean them up so that I've got some nice new clean stuff to work with. I will need to figure out how to get this clip out of there. which actually I'll have to see. Maybe the new control arm will come with one in it. I don't know, but I'm probably going to have to get underneath it and pry it up out of there and hope it doesn't break, which for me is not going to be a disaster because I'm going to be replacing the hubs and the anti-lock brake wire at the same time. But we want to see if we can get that out of there so you can see how to do it if yours doesn't have one on your new control arm. So all right, let's go through those cleaning up steps. We'll try to get that clip out. I'll compare this to my new control arm, and then we'll be back. Okay, just a quickie here. I did get these out, compare them. They are virtually identical, except that we don't have the grease zerk in the new one, so I will need to get myself a new reference mark put in right in the center of that, and that will allow us to take care of that. I tried to get the clip out of here, and the little plastic piece that goes down in that hole broke off, so we're gonna have to figure out. I will show you another way to do that as we put the new one back on before I actually put my brand new piece on there. So I'm going to clean up my bolts now, and I will be back shortly. All right, got all my bolts cleaned up like that. Again, I'm not trying to restore anything here, so they're not perfectly clean. I just want the dirt and rust and loose stuff off of them. Got those ready. I've wire brushed all the loose dirt off of the mounts here. Looks like there might be a little more I could scrape off out of there. I got those cleaned up. Now, one more thing. I've scraped off this deal, but I want to try to clean that hole out. So I'm going to use a battery terminal cleaner and just go down in there because I want all the loose stuff out of there. That needs to be a nice clean metal to metal fit. Yeah, there, that's much better. Get that all cleaned out. Now we should be ready to go back together. All right, so this thing comes with a protector on there to protect the cone and the rubber boot like that. It also came with a new nut and cotter pin to go on the ball joint bolt itself there. So we'll use that instead of the one that came with it. So I'm going to stick this thing back in there and get the bolts started into place. Let me show you one other thing about these bolts. This will be really helpful to us as we are reassembling this. So if you'll notice, the bolts have a D-shaped hole in them rather than just a round hole, and that's because there's a flat edge on one side of that the bolt itself. So we're going to go into here and let's see here. So that will come sit up there like that, and then the other one is going to go on there like that. And what that does, it means that both of these will move basically in unison with each other as they're tightened down and they're riding on those pins right there. And so that will keep them in sync, one on this side and one on that side, and that should allow us to get right back where we need to be. So I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to get myself a center mark on here so that I know exactly where my measurements need to go to, and then I will start putting the thing back in place. We are back here after another couple of days. I had to stop because it was getting late and I ran into a problem. Excuse me. So as these new control arms came from the factory, the bushings were not far enough into them, not pressed far enough in, and so I would stick one side in and my other side would be, geez, at least 1/4 of an inch too wide. So I tried a couple different things. I will tell you that you cannot pound these any farther in with a sledgehammer. I tried that. So I eventually had to go find a press and get somebody to press them a little farther in for me. So now I've got them where they're in the same position as the old ones. And so our next step here then is to shove those all the way in there. And then we're going to put our bolts in. in here. So I'm going to get to that point off camera, and then I'll come back and show you where we go from there. Okay, we've got these two bolts back in place, and you want to put them in and just kind of hand snug the nuts up, because you still want this to be movable up to this point, because now we've got to put the ball joint into the spindle itself. So we need that to be mobile, so we're going to do that. I was going to try to do this one-handed, but I know it's not going to work, so I'll get this back in place and get the nut on it, and then we'll be back. All right, we've got that back in place now. I've got the nut on it under here. And on these, sort of a nut where you've got a tapered fitting like that, they don't have to be hyper tight, but you do need to get a wrench on them and tighten them down good. Then you're looking for, because we've got a castellated nut here, that means it has these slots in it, and it's going to use a cotter pin. You got to find where that cotter pin comes through, and it's actually here. On this one, if I needed to, I could have turned the ball joint so that it was going side to side here instead, but I think I can get it in there all right. So I've got that tightened down pretty tight. I've got my hole lined up for the cotter pin, so the next step is to get that cotter pin and get it put in. And we'll put it in like that, and then we'll just fold over the two sides, one direction, one the other direction, and that will be installed. And then it's going to come time to go back to get our alignment set right. So I'm going to be trying to get this center mark that I've made here to match the measurements that I took before. Remember, I had a measurement from here up to the bolt on the bracket there, and also from here straight back over to here. Got those measurements written down, so I'm going to start comparing those. Now, another hint here. One of the reasons that you want to keep the jack underneath that lower control arm while you're doing this is you want this thing to stay at ride height, because that's where you want to set that alignment back at, is where the height that it's riding at. So my first step is going to be try to get the marks that I made over here on this eccentric to line back up with the pin the way that they originally were. So I'm going to set those marks back up to the pins on both of these. I'm going to snug them down, and then I'm going to check these measurements, and that will tell me then what I need to do. And so I'm going to come back as I get those set, and then I'll snug them down, check my measurements, and we'll come back and show you at that point. All right, those are set up now. I think you can see my marks there. There's one on either side of the pin, inside and out, and those are lined up, and I've snugged up there. I've got this one there. You can see my marks lined up with the pin, and that one's snugged up. So now let's take our measurement. That says, can't see it good, about 11 1/8. And I am supposed to be at 10 13/16 on this one. So that means we are too far out by 5/16 of an inch. So I've got to figure out how to crank these farther back in towards the frame of the truck to start with. So I'm going to loosen these up, and I think, yeah, by rotating these down, that's going to shove my bolt back in that direction. I think that's what I want. So I am going to take those loose, and both of them need to go back in order to get me to move the whole thing backwards. You know what? Let's check front to back here while we're at it. You just see where that's sitting at. So right there. And we are at 22 7/8. And we're supposed to be at 22 3/4. So that one's actually quite close. So yeah, we'll try it to start with. We will move loosen both of them and move them back in towards the frame of the truck and see where that takes us. All right, been fiddling around with those just a little bit to try to get these to the right points, and that's got me right there. I'm within about a 1/16 of an inch of where I need to go, which should be okay. I had it exactly on right before I tightened the bolt down, but something must have moved just a touch. Let's see what I got here. One-handed videography. Isn't this awesome? All right, that one is supposed to be at 22 3/4. And it's just about right where it needs to be. So that's got me very, very close to where I need to be to get my alignment back in spec. And I'm going to run it there. If it ends up being a problem, I may come back in and adjust this later. But I don't think it will be a 1/16 of an inch. It's pretty dang close for something like this. All right, so once you've got that in place and this marked back where you want it, you need to tighten these down. I'm sure there's a torque spec on it if you want to look it up, but these are great big old bolts. I don't know, they're 1/2 inch or bigger. I'm not totally sure what size they are. But anyway, you need to crank on these about as hard as you can crank them without putting cheater bars on your wrenches. So just tighten them up good and tight, because you don't want these to come loose, because you don't want your alignment to move on you. So tighten those up good and tight. This one here, we tightened it up before, but it's tight. I got to get the cotter pin bent over, and then we will be in business there. And then I'll come back. Let's see. Well, let's see. The next things I'm going to do here, I'm going to put these brake line brackets back in place. So I'll put this bolt in, I'll put that bolt in, and then I'm going to show you what I'm going to do about this here in order to fix this when you've got a broken clamp but not the right one. All right, I'll be back when I get those ready. Got those tightened in there. I'll show you a simple trick here for something. When you're working with a bolt, the size of that one right there, it's a 10mm headed bolt. I can never remember what the diameter of the shaft of the bolt is, but these are little tiny bolts, 1/4 inch or smaller bolts. When you're working with something like that, you don't want to twist it off in there. And so one of the tricks I've found, I'm using a 3/8 inch ratchet and socket setup here, and I got enough leverage there that I can tighten that thing down and really just snap that right off there. And so if you're using a 1/4 inch drive ratchet, you can tell pretty good when that's snugged up. So, but here's just a little trick. Get a hold of the ratchet on a longer ratchet up in this area, and you can tell when you get it tightened up there, and then you're not exerting enough leverage to break that bolt off. And so I got that one tightened up, got that one tightened down. Now what do we do on this broken clamp here? What I did is I took myself a hose clamp. I've got plenty of room over here. I don't think I'm ever gonna, as that thing moves, I don't think the shock's gonna come significantly closer there. So I put this hose clamp on and clamped the old bracket, and so I just had the nub broken off the bottom. So I've got the old plastic clamp in there. This is around it, and that will hold that in place and should last the life of the truck at that point. So that is where we're at right at the moment. That's got our control arm part of the build taken care of. We got our alignment back in place. Now we're just ready to start putting the thing back together. So we will come back at the next point, which is going to be putting our brake caliper bracket back on here. So we'll be back at that point. Now we got that all done. We're ready to put the caliper bracket back in place. Now I took all my bolts and stuff earlier, and I wire brushed them so they'd be nice and clean, easier to work with. So those are ready. We've got our brake pads spread out a little bit. That one's actually getting a little bit on the thin side. I'm going to need to change them here one of these days. But I want them spread out so that they'll fit over my rotor. So we'll get those in there. Set that over the rotor like that. Hold it in place with my fancy knee move here while we get a bolt stuck in the back of it. Let's see if we can get that to start. Yeah, that's not going to work very good. All right, I'll go do that off camera. I'll put these two bolts in, one down here, and get them tightened up. All right, those two bolts we've got tightened up. These are big bolts, so you can put about all the pressure you can get on them with your standard ratchet, and you'll be just fine. You want these tight. These are the main bolts that hold your braking system in place, and therefore they're the bolts that stop your vehicle. So you want them in there good and solid. All right, next thing is to get our caliper pulled back over here and set it down over the pads. I don't know if I can do that with one hand. We'll give it a try here. And there's something that's probably going to happen here that you'll just need to be aware of. Actually, it's not. Okay. Sometimes sitting up there like that, especially with the time frame, I've had this off for nearly a week. Somehow some fluid will seep down in there and it will push the pistons out a little bit and they won't go over your pads. So at that point, you need to get one big C-clamp per piston, and this is a 2-piston caliper. So put a big C-clamp on those pistons like that and gently start tightening those clamps up until you get the pistons to move back in a little bit. And it takes time for that fluid to work its way back up there, so you need to snug up the clamps, put some pressure on them, just a little bit of hand pressure, and let them move that fluid back up, and then tighten them a little more and move the fluid, and tighten them a little more and move the fluid. And most cases on most disc brake systems that will work. There are a couple of them that I've run into that actually have a mechanical adjuster inside of that piston there, and those you have to do differently, but fortunately it's not on these Silverados. So anyway, that's just a simple trick for compressing those caliper pistons. But these have gone on there, so I need to make sure that I get these little boots to go back in there like that instead of bending them over, so that the bolts will actually fit on them. So that's I'm going to do that, get this in place, and then we'll be ready to start our bolts into it. Okay, now we're ready to put the caliper pins in. And these are different than a regular bolt. They're threaded up at this end, and so the other end of that thing is what the caliper slides back and forth on. So that shaft needs to have that grease on it that's there. It needs to stay lubricated. So we're going to put these in there and get them down to where they need to be, and then they should start threading themselves back in there. Again, that's going to be a two-handed process, so that's what we're going to do next. I will tighten those back up. This time I won't use my air wrench. I will use my ratchet to get them nice and tight. Again, they're pretty large diameter here, so you want to tighten them down pretty significantly. Be careful because they're Torx. You can strip the heads out on them pretty easily, but tighten them down to where they're pretty tight. Here we go. Got those bolts tightened down, and essentially that completes our installation of these hubs and of the control arms, if that's what you're working on too. One little thing here, I had noticed early on that this little rubber cap for that caliper bleeder screw had fallen off somewhere, and you really want to keep those as much as you can. What happens is the bleeders fill up with dirt and get corroded, and then they don't work well whenever you have to adjust them. So I was able to find that again, so I've got it back on there. Really, that's the completion of the process. All that's left is to put our wheel back on. So we'll do that, and I think we'll be ready to go. Looking around to see if I have spare parts here, and I don't. There is a nut right there, but that's the one that got replaced by that castellated nut and the cotter pin. So I think we're good to go. I'll get stuff out of the way here and get my tire back on, wheel and tire. There we go, we're back on. Couple last little tips and tricks here, and these are just not hardly even related to what we just did, except for taking the wheel off and on. These nut covers on these Chevys, they're just made out of plastic, and when you tighten them, you need to just snug them up good by hand. Don't wrench on them real hard. I mean, you got to put the lug wrench on them to do it, but snug them up. Don't try to tighten them up, because they don't tighten, they just strip out. And you know, in modern tire shops today, they're always torquing your lug nuts down with a torque wrench. That is a safety thing to cover their behinds. What happens if you tighten your lug nuts unevenly, they can actually warp the rotor and cause problems in there. This one not so much, because the lug nuts aren't fastened to the rotors, but on a lot of other types of cars, they are fastened to the rotors. But you want to tighten your lug nuts in a cross pattern, a star pattern. So here to here, to here to here, to here to here. And just tighten them down so that they feel the same with the torque wrench, or with the lug wrench when you tighten them down. And that will have them tightened evenly, and you won't have to worry about it. The only times that doesn't work is when your lug nuts or your bolts are really rusty, or you have gotten something cross-threaded and messed up the threads, and then maybe it's time to change out a lug nut or a lug bolt. But you can still get a pretty good feel for that as how they're going to tighten down. So anyway, that's just a couple little tips there from a guy who's been doing this all of his life. Anyway, that, boys and girls, is how you change a front bearing hub on one of these, and in the other side of the video, how you change the control arm. So there we go. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope it's proven useful. I tried to give you as many details as I could as I went along. This is really a simple thing to do, relatively, if you follow the steps in this video. Probably, had I been doing this just on my own, either one of those operations would at max have taken me about 2 hours. So that's where we're going to leave this at. Hope you enjoyed the video. Have a great day, and good luck working on your truck. Just thought I'd throw in this quick little piece here. I did the other side here without all the delays and things that took place, you know, doing the filming and things. And this side, doing the control arm and the wheel bearing hub, took me right about 2 hours to do. So I just thought I'd throw that in there just so you got a little reference point. As long as your control arm bushings are in the right place, and you don't have to press them on like I had to do with mine, or press them farther in, you should be able to just slip that in there and get that done in a couple hours. If not, you got to add in whatever time it's going to take to find somebody with a press to move those. So there you go.